So yes, as has been mentioned, my everyday practice is basically a kind of applied critical service design. My connection actually with African speculative fiction, originates from the fact that I'm just generally a science fiction and speculative fiction and fantasy and other genre fiction geek. As well as the fact that almost 10 years ago, some colleagues and I created Afrofutures UK because we're interested in all things in Afrofuturism, but particularly from a Black British perspective. And that has led to, amongst other things, becoming part of the Black speculative arts movement, spearheaded by Professor Reynaldo Anderson, and kind of being more recently involved in projects that really are focused on creating like knowledge structures or involving, say, young people in developing their sense of like the way racism impacts them, for example, again, with that mindset of empowering people to think about sort of policies, the kind of things that they would like to see created as services in their communities. And certainly as someone who is Igbo and of the diaspora with Nigerian parents, it also has to be said that African speculative fiction provides a really important way of understanding and kind of keeping up to date with the preoccupations and critical visions of people across, not just in Nigeria, but like throughout the African continent. And it's also just really great stuff to read. So that's basically me. UX and service design, critical design methods, very interested and kind of uses a lot of Afrofuturism as a methodology, and generally the kind of person who likes to make stuff happen. So kind of straddle the line between academic and maker, as it were. So the provocation behind this talk was the phrase, Africa is the future. Which is a statement pretty frequently heard by those of us perhaps who are more interested in global affairs or policy or global policy, often justified by the fact that apparently by 2050, Africa's population is estimated to double to 2.8 billion people. Although, before anyone starts justifying eugenic rhapsodies, I think it's also worth remembering that there are other projections for other continents. So, for example, Asia will reach 5.3 billion by that time. And so for me, the immediate response to the statement is, well, for whom? Because you see, even today, the vast majority of structures controlling the flow and trade of resources are not, in fact, controlled by African states of any kind, yet alone by the people, by the workers. The cost of neo-colonial extraction is evidence in the horrendous situations that we see in Congo and Sudan. And then if we look at the political situation, the way that all too many governments will tend towards authoritarian methods in order to control the burgeoning young population, despite the fact that 70% of the population is under 30, Nigeria, the self-proclaimed heartbeat of Africa, is willing to slaughter its future contingent youth as they protest against police brutality. And when we see the kinds of deals made by, for example, the Kenyan president, William Ruto, any cynicism about what kind of precedent this implies for the future of Africa should at least be empathized with, I suspect. Such a cynicism is especially unsurprising also that whilst Africa may well be the future, other continents will still exist in the future too. And as we see the continual construction of, say, Fortress Europe in context of climate shifts, it's not unreasonable to ask what other futurities the Africa of 2050 will encounter. It would be very tempting, I think, also to see this as somehow cyclic, but this, of course, wouldn't be true. In some ways, Africa isn't only the future as much as it is the eternal present. When we read, for example, about Kenyan workers scrubbing the internet clean or performing automated marvels on behalf of OpenAI and ChatGPT, what I am particularly reminded of is the equivalent strange disappearances of the Black person amongst the machinery of the plantation and the colonial enterprise. So as an example, I'm really into the work of John E. Crowley, who in his paper, Sugar Machines, Picturing Industrialized Slavery, talks about the vanishing of the Black figure in the early modern popular conception of the sugar industrial complex. And he particularly frames this with the obsession with machinery that the early modern European mind had. as he says, and it's quite a cute little, it's like a darkly cute little quote, which I always like to say, sugar fascinated many early modern Europeans because machines made it, and they loved machines. And yet these early modern representations of sugar plantations would always privilege machinery over people. And he goes on to say, like, in view of the labor, discipline, organization of work, in many ways, the sugar manufacture was actually the most industrialized form of human enterprise during the early modern period. Pride in the technological process embodied in the sugar plantation, however, carried dire humanistic implications because it implicitly rationalized slavery and the Atlantic African slave trade. And again, for those of you who might be interested in, say, the history of and development of technology, particularly in this context, whilst obviously there's always going to be lots of very interesting debates, one of the things that I've always found particularly fascinating from a history of technology perspective is actually the notion that that there were actually very, quite significant technological developments across plantations, whether British, French, or Spanish, which again kind of speak to the reality that actually technological advancement does not in any way correlate to, say, moral advancement. Because often, if you identify the points at which the plantation technology actually became more and more advanced, often spearheading and in fact influencing things happening in the Industrial Revolution in the Imperial metropole, those were perhaps paradoxically, but as I will reveal, not really a paradox. Those were the same eras at which we see more and more enslaved Africans being imported into the plantation system. So the correlation, the perhaps assumed correlation between, say, technological development and progress it was certainly not evidenced in this particular time. And I think it's something that for those of us who are kind of interested in that socio-technical context of technological development and indeed the policy that surrounds it, provides a very interesting precedent. After all, we too, dazzled in the 21st century equivalent of action at a distance, are so desperate to commit the final divorce from our material connections that we fantasize about so-called AI, whilst in reality it is often poorly remitted human intelligence, once again doing the brunt work. And similarly, when we look at current discourse, for example, around intellectual property, the use of automation, we see a similarity between contemporary subaltern encounters with digital technology to those conditions in the plantation, where technological innovation is a mark of a politically specific futurism, not of benevolence or moral development. Meanwhile, here in the UK, closer to home, where activists are still battling the injustice of the Windrush scandal, governments are still touting the UK to its former African and Caribbean colonies. One wonders if their cyber data policy has improved that much to be worth the risk. And as an aside, I recently encountered this article about how England is locked in this global tussle for teachers. And I couldn't help but be reminded of a similarity of framing to a certain conference of 1884. So I'm using all these as kind of continual examples amongst many that should remind us of how fundamental to our world order, as it were, is like anti-Black racism. There is this deep foundational connection between anti-Blackness and indeed anti-indigeneity and modernity, and of course, ultimately post-modernity and meta-postmodernity. The financial structures, after all, required to profit from the kidnapping trade across almost unfathomable stretches of ocean at the time, ultimately ended up creating our mortgage systems, and that in turn were warped and extracted from to create a global economic crash in 2008. The routes mapped to most effectively transport human cargo and the means of mercantile domination become the foundations of an internet that is simultaneously the site of exploitation and appropriation. Indeed, now we find through embedded algorithmic biases that the digital descendants of these socio-technical systems not only reflect the white supremacist framework, but exacerbate and reify it. Our knowledge structures also cannot escape from this ghastly entanglement. As a movement, Rose Must Fall highlighted some of the historic connections between universities and colonialism, a connection that is still applicable here, wherein we occupy the site of the Imperial Institute, which was, to quote Aldrich in his paper in his book, Colonial Museums in a Post-Colonial Europe, intended to be a centre for the empire in London, constructed not only out of the profits from unequal imperialist trade, but as a display also of empire. And indeed, early in the paper, if you're interested, in case you want to check it out, he describes how there was a poem composed for the opening of London's Imperial Institute, vaunted the empire of 1,000 years, which I think further exacerbates, further demonstrates this actually quite unabashed connection. Even going further back, the modernist scientific project itself betrays this very interesting and intriguing tangle of motivations if we consider the works of folks like Francis Bacon, who admittedly is quite an easy target, whose backhanded compliments to nature as the source of a canny humanity's might are adjacent to how such skills enable, in some ways almost necessitate, domination over humans outside the borders of race and creed. Poems to empire, fantasies of obedient nature, imagery of compliant or non-existent enslaved labor, even the very notion of race and nations contained within borders, as to think more critically, I think is often revealed when people are talking about Africa as the future and the way that this is apparently, this is derived from this notion of the African population, forgetting, in fact, that Africa is as much actually part of the Black Atlantic, part of a much wider diaspora that is as much part of Europe and Asia and America. Nonetheless, this part of this fantasy, all of these are nothing but stories, myths, narratives that sustain every drop of the stock market, every arrest in the hood. Calvin Warren, as he talks about ways of the Black presence, both being seen and not being seen in his 2018 work, Ontological Terror, Blackness, Nihilism, and Emancipation, states how all of this indicates the way we are in a system that necessitates, as he would say, the intensity of Black suffering, spiritual and physical deprivation, political demoralization, and the proliferation and permanency of necropolitical agendas. And in this way, he points to a reality of how anti-Black logics that are fundamental epistemological structures have evolved over the past 600 years. But as even the comparatively light-hearted example of international teacher recruitment shows, they are not new. And even their evolution has not really shifted that much. So when there is talk about Africa as the future, the question of for whom is one that's cognizant of this reality, this eternal present. It starts a narrative inquiry of its own that can more effectively tell a story, not just of how technological and economic progress and social development might actually emerge and work together and be managed for the collective good, but what it even means to progress and to develop. Applied speculative fiction is one method in which critical perspectives on the future can help us think more holistically about the consequences of how technology fits and works within this kind of world order as described by Warren and others. So this is a point where I really want to do a shout out to the kind of people, to some people who are doing some really interesting work in this space. So in particular, there's Leslie Ann Noel, who is the Black lady with dreadlocks and red beads jewelry, whose work very much inspired me, but very much centers using Afrofuturism and Afrofuturist narratives as part of almost like a repertoire of like design thinking methodologies. And some of, again, actually a lot of our work is available to read very freely on ResearchGate, and, you know, in particular thinking about the paper Design Thinking and Empowerment of Students in Trinidad and Tobago, again, kind of really shows the value of taking these speculative methods in systems, in essentially service design, of which creating policies on at different levels is a part of that. Another example, so again, the other Black lady with braids, with golden coloured braids. is the Brazilian Zeca dos Santos, who's also a fellow member of the Black speculative arts movement, a data scientist, multi-artist, curator, designer, fiction writer, researcher, and CEO of the company Afrofuturismo Arte Estam. Other examples of folks who kind of use speculative fiction as this method of inquiry into how one considers technology and how one can build policy or build ways of working with it or for it or indeed against it. Folks like Stephen Oram, who was the white gentleman with kind of short silvery hair, whose work, who uses like near future, what he calls near future science fiction. And Christine Aicardi, who is the older white lady at the kind of towards the bottom of the slide, whose use of narrative, of speculative narrative, has been applied to critically examine questions of ethics and consensus. What is quite powerful about this notion of the applied speculative perspective is the way that it can, encourage one to simply slow down and think through the various what ifs, as it were, of whether a new bit of technology or kind of a new scientific finding or whatever. Or it can help us completely reframe a problem by using narrative devices from impersonation, characterization, or things like one of the things that I've often found quite powerful with some students, using kind of like the butterfly effect, kind of you just imagine what one small thing could change in someone in the day of a life of someone. Even the very process of collective writing, for example, is key as a means to bring others along the journey of kind of collectively and holistically and still critically interrogating what the problem space and what the future space could look like, but always with that endpoint in mind. Now, there are a lot of similarities, as you can probably tell from the examples I'm giving, with what's often called speculative design, which actually borrows many techniques from applied speculative fiction. I would say that it's often, however, it seems that the primary difference, although one might say that this is simply a matter of pedantry, I'm quite tempted to be that person, because actually a lot of who cares about these epistemological borders? But nonetheless, one of the key differences is often that the applied speculative fiction route, rather than using the broad and holistic to narrow in, perhaps, on a particular feature of a technology, which is often what the speculative design as a process is more focused on, rather than honing in what it prefers to do, is kind of keep things holistic in order to consider the whole in and of itself. And I think certainly for those who might be interested in this approach, or either of these approaches when developing or framing policy development, because there are definitely examples of the use of speculative design methods in order to generate policy. Often if you read the case studies, sometimes what you'll find, again, the interesting difference, which again may not well be much of a difference in reality, is that the speculative design methods are very useful if one is really trying to almost like write, it's almost like if you're literally trying to write the lines of policy, if you're really almost trying to get to those details. And then the applied speculative fiction method can still keep almost like a sense of the broader borders of either the document or the way that it can be serviced or supported by wider systems. Nonetheless, because again, that may well be considered kind of academic wrangling, this commitment to the whole is, I think, why there is so much potential for the applied speculative approach, particularly when used for policy, and particularly when thinking about the emergent outcomes of new technologies on a global scale. It seems to me like it is particularly useful for understanding, as I said, scale and impact borders, as opposed to speculative design. But again, these are often things that work hand in hand. It's almost a truism to say that speculative fiction talks as much about present conditions as it does the future. So with that truism in mind, we can say that African speculative fiction written in what is in many ways an apex of conditions as described by Calvin Warren, is able to critically incorporate these eternal presents, as I've mentioned, by its very existence, providing another lens into the African futurity that is so casually mentioned in projections of a future world order. If we are to take the socio-technical challenge of technological development seriously and follow someone like Albert Kahn's lines of thought about how the ways of making and the context in which things are made incorporate themselves into the end result, yes, that means having to account for realities of racial and racialized capitalisms when it comes to the delivery, development, and framing of new technologies. What the speculative fiction can do is embed these realities into narrative logic, making them tangible enough almost to taste, rather than keeping them as numbers and percentages. Yet all this promise is predicated on a commitment to looking, to realizing so much of we experience, from race to gender to the nation state, are narratives, if not ours, then made up by someone else. But as we're in the mood, here's a narrative to end on. At the beginning of the talk, I mentioned the online hidden scrubbers of the internet, experiencing trauma on our behalf to keep the internet moderately usable. Not so much ghosts in the shell, but fellow workers hidden beneath layers of capitalist self-absorption and an almost maliciously naive techno-optimism. They worked, they connected, and they organized. In the spring of 2023, they announced the formation of the African Moderators Union, advocating for better pay and working conditions, launching a suit against one of the main tech Goliaths of our time, Meta itself. The story is far from over. Perhaps some of them hear that maybe their example has inspired a young miner almost on the other side of the continent. These miners are having quiet meetings after their shifts too, exhausted, texting minutes and actions to their cousins in Nantes, Western France. Some of the African Moderators Union reps are inspired by this, but others are maybe worried because they're worried that maybe this new attention, that more attention might be paid to them, given all these others across the African continent who may well be inspired by them. Many in this union went to school, went to university, and some think it might make them look a little bit unprofessional. It might kind of harm their interests to be seen in any way as allies with illiterate miners in Central Africa. Others don't pay attention to these discussions. There are so many more to organize around the world too, not solely in Kenya, not solely in Africa. What about the call centers in Delhi? And weren't there game devs who created a union in the USA? There are more battles to fight, new structures to build, especially as this AI stuff is getting bigger. Whilst I think Warren speaks the truth about the Black condition, so does this reality. These are also the conditions that African speculative fiction speaks to. And I think the question for all of us is essentially this: how then do we choose the next chapter to begin? Thank you very much.
Quite good, quite informative, and it gives us a glimpse of what can come off in terms of the speculative fiction space. We'll open it up for questions.
Yes, that's fine.
Questions from the audience? Yeah.
I find, so maybe I'm just a bit of a silent, but I find often the language that is used is beyond me and uses words that I don't understand, and that came up several times. Given that you're dealing with an enormous diversity of representations, how do you begin to find any kind of common language that allows for for any kind of speculation to sit on something that is commonly understandable?
Mhm. Yeah, that's an excellent question. So there are sort of two approaches to that, I suppose, or to start answering the question about how one, given the diversity of, I mean, for this, in this example, we can simply look at the Black and the African and the Black experience and the Black reality, which is indeed multiple. How does one create something or build something that can have this kind of, any commonality across it? And I think on the one hand, one simply can't. And it's fine to admit that and to start with that assumption, to start with that understanding. And then with that comes often, out of that openness, a kind of humility. I mean, at the very least, that openness means that one can see where perhaps there was enforced consensus being made, for example, in order to kind of make the situation a bit easier to handle and to deal with, and then it can be more critically dealt with. So yeah, that's one aspect. Like actually, you can't. And so what one is driven by is simply to try. And the fact that, well, if we simply let what is complex baffle us and stall us, well, then we wouldn't have done anything. We wouldn't be here. And so, yeah, no, I think it's a very good question. And as someone who, I suppose, in some ways is an engineer of a kind, there is nothing to do but be driven by that imperative to simply make and to try. But at least you know and you understand the context in which it may well fail, or where there may well be smaller failures, if that makes sense. But yeah, ultimately, I'm certainly not one of those who's very good at like false hopes. And I'm also one of those who think, as I said, as an innate engineer, I think the doing in itself is worth the effort, quite frankly. And also there's an awful lot we want to work for, right? We do have a whole climate catastrophe approaching, so
Any other question? Yes.
Do you have any recommended writers for books, or maybe one that's particularly?
Yes, I absolutely. Yeah, this would come up. Yes, this is why it's also very important to be clear about one's positionality. So there's a particular writer, Ogona Chove Ekberry. Actually, if you come down, I'll write it out so that it's clearer. He's one of those kind of rising stars in in especially Nigerian science fiction. But actually, one of the nice things is if you follow him, he's one of those, whether on social media or just follow his work, he's one of those who's actually genuinely quite good at raising the voices of others and kind of bringing awareness of other Black writers, not just in Africa either, but say in the Caribbean. So I'm very fond of some of his work. And then there's kind of the old school, as it were, who are still very, very active and who are kind of, again, often the ones who get mentioned a lot when it comes to Africans or Afrocentric or African-centric science fiction. So someone like Nnedi Okorafor, although technically of the diaspora, very much kind of sees her work as very much rooted in kind of Africanity, and in particular, Nigerian Africanity too. So I think between those two, kind of one of those kind of more of the old school, as it were, and someone who's kind of one of those up and coming bright things. I'm not even going to count how many Hugo Awards he's won. He's very open about it, which I kind of love. Between those two, you'll find plenty.
How do you suggest that African science fiction can influence our understanding on communal consensus on sustainable development goals?
It's a very good question. So I guess in the way that much speculative fiction can give you a sense of certainly the different voices and different concerns, because also there's no, no one science fiction writer of any kind will, have exactly the same concerns or exactly the same kind of beliefs. And also there is something to be said about some science fiction writers. I mean, this is the thing with all writers, to be honest. The message that one might get from their writing may well not be the message that they intended. But yeah, in terms of how it can reflect, I think there's something about kind of clarifying those anxieties or the discussions that are clearly being had within those contexts. I mean, yeah, for example, again, this is more of a classic piece, but it's one that, because it's classic, it's a little bit more accessible. If I think of something like Pumsey, for example, which is a short film that, again, is it's often used as, a really good example of visual or filmic African speculative fiction. Actually, so many of the motifs of the ways of living of the particular character in this future world where, basically, there's huge war. It's a post-apocalyptic world in some ways, right? Many of those motifs and ways of living are resonant of anti-colonial or decolonial writings about, okay, what are the ways that we can incorporate former ways of being without fetishizing or verifying them as somehow innately better, but what are the things that we can learn from the past to help us live in this future where there are glass of water shortages, there are food shortages, we still have ethnic violence, for example, intertribal violence, for example. And so right then and there, so even though, again, it's in many ways you can simply watch it as an interesting post-apocalyptic short African movie, once you kind of pay attention to the motifs, to the language, to the ways of living, you realize it speaks to the kind of conversations actually happening amongst the people who are really seriously thinking, okay, how actually, if we're always going to be essentially the country that ends up exporting most of its youth workforce to Western nations, if the brain drain is still going to be happening, if this is going to still be happening, how actually are we then going to properly live? That's kind of how you start identifying. You can start identifying those kind of conversations and the traces of those conversations in the work. And also the arguments, there's what's it called? I think it's when will there be Black Futures Month? But there's definitely one anthology which I found so interesting because, you would read. There was one particular science fiction I forget the name of the writer, but it was fascinating to me because the short story in particular, it was more horror sci-fi, and that was more focused on. It used kind of very familiar, almost anti-Black tropes, for example, and it was right next to a short story that did the very opposite, that was actually using traditional religion and traditional religious iconography as a sign of futurity, of how this might, enable, say, African and Black communities in the future to live more sustainably or whatever. And yet they're right next to each other in the same science fiction and anthology. So that's not to say that any of that they're all going to innately agree with each other, for example, or that, they're always going to be innately better or more radical. But at the very least, they kind of incorporate and embed those deeper, more challenging conversations that communities are having about this is our reality. What happens next? Does that help?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. And comes is a nice take to watch.
It is nice.
I guess because I'm Kenyan.
Yeah.
But it's really lovely. Any other questions?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
I was just wondering, speaking of Lindsay, about your opinion on kind of any remarks on the position of media within Afrofuturist narratives. Because sometimes there's a bit of a duality to it, where you don't want to portray colonial narratives of fetishizing that, or land being ravaged and the face of feminism within the relationship nature, if that makes sense. So there are very different approaches, I suppose, what a progressive relationship in that.
Yes. No, that is a very good question about the representation of, say, Mother Nature as a concept or similar tropes within sort of like Afrofuturist or African speculative fiction. I must confess what I find quite interesting, and again, being very clear about positionality. So obviously I'm from a West African background. And whilst there is very much, say, in Afrofuturist and Afrofuturist and other kind of African speculative and Black speculative movements, whilst there is often a very intentional reclaiming of, I will use the term divinity, but I think it's also key to not necessarily think of that in a solely theological sense, because it's also as much about reclaiming the dignity of Black women, right, and or indeed the Black femme as well, to go beyond kind of Western cis structures. I often actually think that because of the fact that in many certainly from a West African perspective, because actually quite a few West African earth-related deities aren't romantic, actually. So even if one is doing a sort of pay on to some kind of like innate divine feminine, which actually again often isn't the case. I mean, it's not a famous example, but even like in Northern African mythology, you actually don't, you'll have like the sky is the mother, it's not like Uranus, like the father, you know what I mean? So, that's across like many different African cultures, but I'm just being clear about the ones that I'm most familiar with. And so I think what then ends up happening is that, especially for people who are writing from that kind of heritage, and that includes from the diaspora as well, I think that in itself almost helps deal with any romanticization of Mother Nature, because in a sense, Mother Nature from that particular Afrikaner perspective isn't mother in that same way as, say, Western European or like other traditions, quite frankly. But that's not to say that there aren't challenges with how, in order to bring back that sense of dignity and respect to the Black femme, sometimes then that can almost tip into essentially kind of fetishization, another kind of fetishization of Black or African femininity, right? Because indeed, I mean, it's funny, isn't it? There may well not be Mother Nature, but there definitely is the post-colonial cliche of Mother Africa, right? And that often is the thing that's laden with quite problematic, in some ways, perhaps well-intentioned, but slightly problematic aspects. Don't know, does that help? Is that okay? Cool.
More questions? Have time. Plenty of time. Yes.
This is kind of random, but can you share what can we learn from a movie like Black Panther? This is kind of like random, sorry. And I think it had like many aspects, Black African aspect ties into it, and then from the point of view, what can you share with us?
Oh.
That we can like look even more. Is it related to the topic?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. Okay, yeah.
For the online speakers, could you repeat the question because they don't get
I'll do my best. Thank you for reminding me. Yeah, sorry. So the question, and apologies, I'm really sorry about that. The question is about what can be learned from, say, something like the Black Panther, especially in this regard. Okay, so I mean, because you can read what you're meant to get from it everywhere on the internet. So I will just be very specific about my own personal approach to it. I think it's so fascinating as someone who is Black but of an African origin, because whilst often Wakanda is being treated as this example of like the this amazing non-colonized vision, I actually think it's really interesting because one of the big tensions in the movie is whether Wakanda should help anyone else in Africa. Right. There's definitely, so I have like some colleagues or connections, acquaintances in the Afrofuturist affair. They're a collective based in Philadelphia. And I know one of them very much mentioned like there is this really interesting subtext, well, not even subtext, but about like, you know, trying to almost pit different forms of blackness against each other, like the African versus the African American, which has very real and serious political implications, and is something that's definitely movements trying to do. And I do think there is definitely that aspect to it as well. But as I said, as someone who isn't African American, but is like directly, you know, as my parents Nigerian, I actually think it's still. It's not even necessarily just pitting like the African versus the African American or even the Afro-Caribbean, right? There is something really interesting about the idea that in order to protect, like the way it's justified as well narratively, that in order to protect itself, it couldn't even help, like it couldn't even be bothered to be part of either other revolutionary movements or whatever. And yes, obviously one can say, well, it's just fantasy fundamentally, and that's true, except for it is described as an actual tension. There's a conversation between characters multiple times. You know, the fact that one of the characters is someone who almost gets into trouble with Wakandan authorities because she is known for getting involved with other, you know, freedom movements outside of Wakanda. So I think. So if there's anything that I think you can get out of, one of the things I think you can get out of the Black Panther movies is sort of like, it's just kind of that really, it's quite, I mean, beyond also the fact that you have like overt CIA engagement, which at least is honest. That is actually how things work in Africa. The CIA do get involved and yes, do things. But yeah, there is something very kind of, I think also quite ghastly. I think also speaks to some of those entanglements, right? And about the limits of our imagination, the idea that in order to be protected and to keep itself safe, it sort of had to abandon everyone else, you know? Mind you, there are, okay, now at this point, I will get a bit naughty. As I said, I try to be very honest about my positionality, so you understand. I'm definitely not speaking from a neutral position in any way, shape, or form. So obviously, as I mentioned, I'm Nigerian, but I'm specifically Igbo, so southeastern Nigeria. And I remember once speaking to my dad, who was very much part of the outside of Nigeria, like the pro-Biafran movement or the protests, because there were huge protests, you know, trying to protest about like Britain's involvement in supporting the Nigerian state committing genocide against the Igbo people. And I always found it really fascinating that he was so interestingly, not xenophobic, but very, very unimpressed with the character of Haile Selassie. And as a diasporan Black person, so as a Nigerian in the diaspora, you know, you almost want to kind of be pro everyone who's African and you know, and whatever. And Haile Selassie is someone who, like, say, from the history textbooks that I was reading, was always presented in this very sympathetic and noble light. Because, for example, I first encountered him in World War II, in the run up to World War II, and the crisis of Italy kind of, you know, invading, trying to recreate the Roman Empire, the failure of the League of Nations, and Haile Selassie is always portrayed as this like suffering, noble emperor. And there is this kind of mystique, misplaced, I would say, of Ethiopia as like, you know, the one African nation that was never, ever, you know, conquered or whatever, or colonized rather. But actually, it was really interesting speaking to my father, who would say that, well, actually, what was for him, there's none of that mystique, because Haile Selassie was first and foremost a monarch, even when he was no longer monarch. And one example of that was the fact that when there were actual like Biafrans, who actually often, you know, the majority of Igbo people, for example, in this day and age are Christian, for example, and we're kind of expecting at least like this other Black kind of, obviously, again, like sort of like a representation of like a kind of Black African Christianity to like be on their side. And he was like, no, he absolutely was not. In any way, shape, or form, there was absolutely no sense of like connection, or no sense that they should be supporting us or whatever. And so actually watching Black Panther, because of the fact that the mystique and the central conceit is that this is one of those African countries that has never been colonized, I often think about my father and his critique of rulers like Haile Selassie, who, from his perspective, in a very real political sense, actually completely sold out even those that there was even some kind of like religious or like cultural like You know, and it's kind of like, yeah, you know, what does it mean then to be known as like the African country that was never colonized if you can't even put it to good use, you know? Sorry, so that's me being a bit naughty. But
Good naughty.
I hope so. I hope so. I mean, technically, he started it, really. I'm just the innocent victim. No, thank you.
Any questions? More questions?
It's mine time.
And that's when there's always going to be more questions. So
Thank you very much for making time once again to come for this seminar. I hope you learned quite a lot. You have our emails, and so please, if you have any further questions, please do email us. But also, thank you very much, Florence, for presenting this to us today. Thank you very much, and I hope in future we welcome you again to come and do this soon. Thank you very much.